They say war is hell, a crucible that burns away humanity, leaving only ash and the bitter taste of survival. But what if, in the midst of that inferno, a flicker of light, a spark of kindness, could ignite? What if the enemy, the one you've been taught to despise, suddenly becomes a face, a family, a child? In the final desperate days of World War II, as the American war machine rolled across the shattered landscape of Okinawa, something extraordinary happened. Soldiers, men who had fought their way across the Pacific, came face to face with a population they had been told were fanatics, a people ready to fight to the death. But they saw something else. They saw families, scared and starving, and in the eyes of the children, they saw not the enemy, but a reflection of their own humanity. This is the story of how an act of kindness, a shared meal, transcended the brutal realities of war and forever changed the lives of those on both sides of the battlefield. It's a story of empathy, of a simple truth that even in the darkest of times, compassion can endure. The air on Okinawa was thick with the stench of death and decay. It clung to everything. The shattered remains of homes, the blasted earth, the very uniforms of the men who marched through it. For Sergeant Jack Miller, a veteran of Guadalcanal and Peleliu, the smell was a constant companion, a grim reminder of the price of every inch of ground gained. He had seen things no man should ever have to see, and a hardness had settled in his soul, a protective shell against the endless horror. His platoon, a mix of fresh-faced recruits and seasoned veterans, moved through a village reduced to rubble, their rifles held high, their senses on high alert. The official story, the one they had been told in countless briefings, was that the Japanese would fight to the last man, that every civilian was a potential threat, a human shield or a willing suicide bomber. But as they rounded a corner, they found something that contradicted every briefing, every propaganda film. A small family, a mother and two young children, a boy and a girl, crouched in the remains of a cellar, their faces streaked with dirt and terror. The children's eyes, wide and hollow with hunger, stared at them, not with defiance, but with a plea that transcended language. The mother, her face a mask of exhaustion, pulled the children closer, a futile gesture of protection. The platoon froze, their training warring with the raw human scene before them. Jack felt a sudden sharp pang in his chest. The children reminded him of his own little brother and sister back home. He looked at his men, at their tight jaws and tense shoulders, and saw the same conflict playing out on their faces. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also sons, brothers, fathers. He slowly lowered his rifle, the click echoing in the tense silence. He saw Private Tommy Henderson, a young man who had just turned 18, staring at the little girl, his face a mixture of fear and pity. Tommy's hand trembled as he reached into his pack, his fingers closing around a K-ration, a small but precious tin of food. Jack knew this was a moment of truth, a test not of their courage, but of their humanity. He gave a slight nod, a silent permission. Tommy, still hesitant, took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the little girl. He knelt down, slowly and deliberately, and offered the tin of food. The mother recoiled, her fear still dominant, but the little boy, driven by a hunger no fear could suppress, reached out a trembling hand. The girl, watching her brother, followed suit. They looked at the tin, then at the American soldier, their small faces a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. The silence stretched, a fragile bridge between two worlds, two enemies. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. Was this a trick? A prelude to an ambush? His training screamed at him to be suspicious, to be on guard. But the vulnerability of the family, the raw hunger in the children's eyes, was a more powerful force. He watched as Tommy, with a gentle movement, opened the tin and held it out. The children, their fear finally overcome by their hunger, began to eat, their small hands tearing at the food with a desperate urgency. The mother, tears welling in her eyes, bowed her head in a silent gesture of thanks. The sound of their eating, a small, quiet, and deeply human sound, was the only thing that broke the oppressive silence. It was an act that defied every rule of war, every lesson they had ever learned. It was an act of grace in the midst of hell. As they ate, Jack noticed the mother's eyes, no longer filled with fear, but with a profound, almost disbelieving gratitude. The children, their bellies slowly filling, looked up at Tommy, their small faces now a little brighter, a little less hollow. This was not the enemy. This was a family. And in that moment, the line between soldier and civilian, between conqueror and conquered, blurred into a single shared humanity. But their moment of quiet compassion was about to be shattered. A sudden sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed through the village, and a man fell to the ground, not a soldier, but a civilian, a man with a child's hand clutched in his own. A sudden commotion erupted, and a small boy, no older than 10, came running out of the rubble, his face twisted with grief and rage. He held a small rusted knife, and his eyes, filled with a fury born of loss, were fixed on the American soldiers. The boy's charge was a desperate, tragic blur of motion. Sergeant Miller, his mind screaming at him to react, saw the raw grief in the child's eyes. This wasn't a soldier, a trained killer. This was a boy who had just watched his father die. He barked an order, "Hold your fire! Hold your fire!" The men, their reflexes honed by months of combat, hesitated, their fingers twitching on the triggers. Private Henderson, still kneeling by the family in the cellar, looked up, his face a mask of horror. He saw the boy, the knife, and the grim reality of a war that claimed not just soldiers, but children. The boy was fast, fueled by a blind, irrational rage. He closed the distance between himself and the nearest soldier, a young private named O'Connell. O'Connell, caught off guard, raised his rifle, not to shoot but to block. The boy's momentum carried him forward, and he stumbled, the knife clattering uselessly on the ground. He lay there, sobbing, a small broken heap of grief and rage. Jack knelt down beside him, his voice low and steady. He said something in English that the boy couldn't understand, but his tone, his posture, was one of empathy, not aggression. He reached out a hand not to grab, but to comfort. The boy flinched but didn't pull away. It was a fragile, tentative moment. Just then, a group of Japanese soldiers emerged from the shadows, their rifles raised. They had heard the shot, the commotion, and had come to investigate. They saw their countrymen, a family cowering in a cellar, a young boy sobbing on the ground, and American soldiers standing over them. Their leader, a stern-faced corporal, barked an order in Japanese. Jack and his men, their rifles now raised, prepared for a firefight. The situation was teetering on a razor's edge. A single wrong move, a misunderstanding, could turn this tense standoff into a bloody massacre. But the Japanese corporal, his eyes scanning the scene, saw something that gave him pause. He saw Private Henderson still kneeling, a half-eaten K-ration tin in his hand, a look of profound distress on his face. He saw the mother and her children, their faces no longer contorted with fear, but with a quiet relief. He saw Sergeant Miller, his hand still extended to the sobbing boy, his posture one of peace, not aggression. The corporal lowered his rifle, a slow, deliberate movement. He said something to his men, and they, too, lowered their weapons, though their eyes remained fixed on the Americans. He then spoke to Jack in broken English. "Why, you here?" Jack, his heart still pounding, answered, "We came to help." The corporal looked at him, then at the family in the cellar. "You are not enemy?" Jack shook his head. "No, not to them." The corporal's face, for the first time, softened. He walked over to the family in the cellar and spoke to them in rapid Japanese. The mother, her voice filled with emotion, explained what had happened. She pointed to Tommy, to the tin of food, and to Sergeant Miller. The corporal listened, his face a study in a mix of emotions, surprise, relief, and a profound, weary sadness. He then turned back to Jack and bowed his head slightly. "Thank you," he said, "for my people." It was a stunning moment of shared humanity. Two enemies, brought together by an act of kindness, were now communicating not as soldiers, but as men. The corporal explained that his unit was cut off, running low on supplies, and that many civilians were hiding in the area, starving. He asked if they had more food, more medical supplies. Jack, without hesitation, nodded. "We'll get some." "We'll be back." The corporal, his face still etched with the weariness of war, nodded. "I will wait," he said. "We will not fight." As Jack and his men retreated, a tense silence fell over the village. They had to get back to their command post, to get the supplies, to convince their superiors that this was not a trap. But the trust, the fragile bond they had forged, was now a weight on their shoulders. They had made a promise, and they had to keep it. But as they neared their forward command post, they were met by a new and terrifying reality. The sound of artillery fire, a new and different kind of thunder, began to fill the air. It was a sound Jack knew all too well, the sound of an American airstrike, a massive bombardment, moving directly towards their position, towards the village, towards the families they had just promised to help. The ground trembled beneath their feet, a deep guttural tremor that spoke of overwhelming power. The sky, once a brilliant blue, was now a canvas of smoke and fire. The sounds of the approaching bombardment were a deafening symphony of destruction. Sergeant Miller's heart sank into his stomach. An airstrike, a massive one. They were too close. The coordinates must be off. The village, the families, the Japanese soldiers who had put their trust in them, they were all in the kill zone. There was no time to turn back, no time to warn them. The command post was too far away, and the radio was useless under the barrage. "We gotta run!" yelled Private Henderson, his voice barely audible over the roar. "We gotta get out of here!" But Jack shook his head. "No," he said, his voice hard with resolve. "We can't." His men stared at him, their faces pale with a mix of fear and confusion. "Sergeant will be killed," cried one of the new recruits. "We can't help them if we're dead." Jack looked at him, his eyes filled with a grim determination. "We made a promise," he said. "We can't just abandon them, not now, not when they trusted us." He pointed to a small ravine, a deep gully that snaked through the countryside. "That's our only chance. Get down there now!" His men hesitated, their training screaming at them to take cover, to retreat to a safer position. But they saw the look in their sergeant's eyes, a look that said he would not leave no matter what. They followed him, scrambling down the steep, rocky incline, their bodies low to the ground as the first shells began to land, their concussive force slamming into the earth, shaking it to its core. They reached the bottom just as the full fury of the bombardment descended. The air was filled with a cacophony of explosions, a relentless, bone-shaking thunder. The earth erupted around them, geysers of dirt and debris flying into the air. The smell of cordite and burning earth was overpowering. They huddled together, their faces pressed into the dirt, their hands over their ears as the ground pulsed with the force of each blast. Jack, his mind racing, prayed. He prayed for the families, for the Japanese soldiers, for a miracle. He knew the odds were against them. The ravine, while offering some protection, was no guarantee of survival. But it was all they had. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The world was nothing but noise, fire, and the constant, violent shudder of the earth. Finally, as suddenly as it had begun, the shelling stopped. The silence that followed was a strange, deafening vacuum. They slowly raised their heads, their ears ringing, their bodies numb with shock. The landscape around them was unrecognizable. The small village, a place of broken homes and quiet despair, was now a scorched wasteland, a smoking testament to the power of modern warfare. Blackened craters pockmarked the earth, and the air was still thick with acrid smoke. They crawled out of the ravine, their bodies aching, their minds reeling. They had to see. They had to know. As they neared what was left of the village, a grim sight met their eyes. The landscape was utterly devastated. Not a single structure remained. The cellar where the family had hidden was now just a deep, smoking pit. A profound, sick feeling of failure washed over Jack. He had promised. He had failed. But then a sound. A small, faint sound, a child's cry carried on the wind. They froze, their senses on high alert. The sound came from a deep, miraculously untouched crevice in the earth, a natural depression that had somehow, inexplicably, been spared. They scrambled towards it, their hope, a fragile thing, now rekindled. They found them there, the mother, her 2 children, the sobbing boy, and the Japanese corporal and his men. They were alive, bruised, battered, and terrified, but alive. The corporal looked at Jack, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief. He didn't say a word, but his eyes, filled with a raw, profound gratitude, spoke volumes. He had trusted the American soldier, and that trust had been repaid. It was a victory not of arms, but of humanity. But their brief respite was shattered by the arrival of an American patrol, led by a hard-nosed, by-the-book captain, who saw only a group of enemy soldiers and civilians, not the human beings Jack had just saved. "What the hell is going on here, Sergeant?" he bellowed, his rifle held high. "Why are you consorting with the enemy? This is a violation of direct orders." The captain's eyes were cold and unyielding, and in them, Jack saw not the understanding of a fellow soldier, but the rigid adherence to a rule book that couldn't comprehend what had just transpired. The fragile bridge of humanity they had just built was about to be burned down by the very forces they were a part of. The captain, his name was Barnes, was a man forged in the brutal fires of the Pacific Theater, a man who saw the world in stark black and white, us versus them, a man with no room for ambiguity or compassion. He saw a sergeant and his men standing with enemy combatants and civilians, and he saw a direct violation of protocol, a potential security risk, an act of betrayal. He barked orders, his voice like a whip. "Secure them! Confiscate all weapons! And you, Miller, you're under arrest." Jack stood his ground. "Captain, with all due respect, these people are unarmed civilians and a unit that surrendered." "They're starving. They need food and medical attention," Barnes sneered. "They're Japs, Miller. You think they're any different from the ones who killed our boys on Peleliu? They're all the same. They'll smile to your face and stick a knife in your back." The Japanese corporal, his face a mask of weary defiance, stepped forward, speaking in his broken English. "No, we are not enemy. We are men. We are fathers." Barnes ignored him, his gaze fixed on Jack. "You've been in the field too long, Miller. You've lost your mind. Get your men to fall in, now." Jack looked at his men. They were all looking at him, waiting. They had been through hell with him, and they had just witnessed an act of profound kindness. They had followed his orders even when it meant risking their own lives. They weren't going to abandon him now. Private Henderson, his voice trembling with emotion, stepped forward. "Sir, Sergeant Miller saved their lives. He saved a bunch of kids. He's a good man. We all saw it." Barnes's face hardened. "Private, you're out of line. One more word and you'll be in the stockade with your sergeant." He looked at the other men, his eyes a cold, hard threat. The men, though they wanted to speak, fell silent. The power dynamic was clear. But then, a sudden, unexpected movement. The little boy, the one who had charged them with a knife, ran to Jack and grabbed his leg, his small face contorted with fear. He pointed at Barnes and then at Jack, a silent plea. It was a gesture that transcended language, a child's desperate attempt to protect the man who had shown him kindness. Barnes's jaw tightened. The scene was an uncomfortable, profoundly human spectacle, one that defied his rigid worldview. But he was a man of rules, not empathy. He motioned to his men. "Move them out. And you, Miller, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do." As they were led away, the Japanese corporal caught Jack's eye. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent message of thanks, a promise of something more. Jack didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing. This wasn't over. He wasn't just fighting for his own skin anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, something more important than military protocol. He was fighting for the very idea of humanity in the midst of war. The patrol led them back to the main encampment, a sprawling, organized hub of military efficiency. Here, the raw chaos of the front lines was replaced by the rigid order of the rear. Jack was taken to a small makeshift office, where he was interrogated by a stern, unyielding lieutenant colonel. The colonel listened to his story, his face impassive, his eyes betraying nothing. He had heard it all before, the excuses, the rationalizations, the pleas for leniency. He saw a man who had gone soft, a man who had forgotten what he was there to do. "Sergeant," he said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone, "you're a good soldier. You've got a fine record, but you violated direct orders. You put your men at risk, and you consorted with the enemy. That's a court-martial offense." Jack looked him in the eye. "Sir, the enemy wasn't an enemy. They were a family. They were starving. We had a chance to do the right thing. We took it." The colonel scoffed. "The right thing? There is no right thing in war, Sergeant. There is only winning. And you don't win by giving aid and comfort to the enemy. You win by killing them. You win by being harder, faster, and more ruthless. We didn't come all this way to hold hands with the people who bombed Pearl Harbor." Just then, a young private, a messenger, burst into the office, his face pale with urgency. He handed a dispatch to the colonel. The colonel read it, his eyes widening in disbelief. He looked up at Jack, a strange, new expression on his face. He read the dispatch again, his brow furrowed in confusion. "This can't be right," he muttered. "This is impossible." He looked at Jack with a newfound, almost wary respect. The dispatch detailed the discovery of a Japanese field hospital, a makeshift clinic hidden in the jungle, filled with wounded American and Japanese soldiers, all being cared for by a small group of Japanese doctors and nurses. It had been found based on intelligence provided by a Japanese corporal, a corporal whose unit had just been saved from an American bombardment by a group of American soldiers. The news of the Japanese field hospital, a sanctuary of shared suffering, spread like wildfire through the encampment. It was a truth too incredible to ignore. The initial skepticism of the officers, the men's disbelief, was slowly replaced by a sense of profound, almost disorienting awe. The Japanese corporal, whose name was Kenji, had kept his word. After they had retreated to a safer position, he and his men had made contact with a larger Japanese unit and relayed the message of the American soldiers' act of kindness and of the American airstrike that almost killed them all. This information had made its way up the chain of command, a fragile thread of communication between two opposing forces, a message of peace in a time of war. The information Kenji provided, a gesture of profound trust, had led to the discovery of the hospital, a place where the lines of allegiance had blurred into a shared bond of pain and healing. The American wounded, men who had been left for dead in the chaos of battle, were being cared for by the very people they had been sent to kill. This revelation, this undeniable proof of shared humanity, forced Captain Barnes and the other officers to confront the uncomfortable reality that their rigid worldview was a lie. Barnes, the man who had been so quick to condemn Jack, now found himself in a difficult position. He had to face the fact that his actions, his rigid adherence to protocol, had almost cost lives, both American and Japanese. Jack, now freed from the brig, was a hero, not for an act of valor on the battlefield, but for an act of compassion. He and his men were lauded not for killing the enemy, but for saving them. The tide of public opinion, even within the regiment, was turning. The men who had been skeptical now looked at Jack with a newfound respect. They saw him not just as a good soldier, but as a good man, a man who had the courage to do the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing to do. The colonel, now thoroughly humbled, apologized to Jack. "Sergeant," he said, his voice low and filled with a weary sincerity, "I was wrong. I was so wrong. You saw something I couldn't see. You saw humanity where I only saw the enemy, the war. It makes you blind." He extended his hand, and Jack, without hesitation, shook it. The war was still raging. The fighting was still fierce. But something had changed. The soldiers now had a new mission. Their orders were no longer just to engage and destroy, but to secure and assist. They were to seek out hidden civilian populations, to provide food and medical aid, to create safe zones. This change in policy, this subtle but profound shift in strategy, was a direct result of Jack's single act of kindness. The story of the American soldier who shared his food with a starving Japanese family became a legend, a small spark of hope in the heart of a brutal war. It was a story told in whispers and then in hushed conversations, a story that offered a different kind of victory, a victory of the spirit. Jack and his men were now at the forefront of this new mission. They were no longer just a fighting unit. They were a humanitarian one. They went into the villages, not with their rifles raised, but with their hands extended, with food and water and medical supplies. They were met at first with suspicion and fear, but as the word spread, as the stories of their kindness grew, that fear began to recede, replaced by a profound, almost disbelieving gratitude. The children, once hiding in the shadows, now came out to greet them. They had no idea what war was, only what hunger felt like. And they knew that these men, these strangers from another land, were the ones who had shown them kindness. It was a fragile peace, a temporary truce, but it was a beginning of something new, something that would transcend the brutal realities of war and lay the groundwork for a future of understanding and reconciliation. But the war wasn't over, and the men who had been with Kenji were now leading a large group of American and Japanese soldiers into a mountain pass, a place known to be the last stronghold of a fanatical Japanese unit, a place where a final bloody confrontation was inevitable. The peace they had built, the humanity they had fostered, was about to be tested in the most violent and brutal way imaginable. The mountain pass was a narrow, treacherous defile, a place where every rock, every crevice could conceal a sniper. The air was thick with a palpable tension, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. The fanatical Japanese unit, led by a colonel known for his ruthlessness, had vowed to fight to the death. They saw surrender as a dishonor, an unforgivable sin against the emperor and their homeland. They would not be swayed by acts of kindness or gestures of peace. For them there was only one path, glorious death in battle. Jack, leading the combined American and Japanese units, felt the weight of every life in his hands. He looked at Kenji, the Japanese corporal who now fought alongside him, a man who had chosen humanity over blind loyalty. Kenji's face was grim. He knew the men they were about to face. They were his countrymen, but their hearts were filled with a hatred that no amount of kindness could extinguish. The plan was simple and yet impossibly dangerous. They would approach the stronghold under a white flag, a gesture of peace and an offer of surrender. It was a long shot, a gamble with the lives of every man present. As they neared the entrance to the pass, Jack raised the white flag high. An American soldier and a Japanese soldier, standing side by side, a symbol of the fragile peace they hoped to forge. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their own footsteps. They reached a small clearing, and a voice, amplified by a loudspeaker, boomed from the cliffs above. It was the Japanese colonel, his voice a venomous hiss of contempt. "Traitors!" he screamed, his words aimed at Kenji and his men. "You have dishonored your ancestors. You have shamed your country. We will not surrender to these Gaijin dogs. We will die with honor." A single rifle shot rang out, and the American soldier holding the white flag fell, a silent testament to the futility of their mission. A firefight erupted, a chaotic maelstrom of gunfire and explosions. Jack, his heart heavy with grief and rage, gave the order to return fire. They were ambushed from every side, caught in a deadly crossfire. The final brutal confrontation had begun. The battle raged for hours. It was a desperate, bloody affair, a grim ballet of death and destruction. Jack fought with a ferocity born of a new kind of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his life or for his country. He was fighting for the ideals he had come to believe in, the ideals of compassion and understanding. He fought for the children, for the families, for the idea that even in the darkest of times humanity could endure. Kenji and his men fought with a quiet, grim determination. They were not fighting their countrymen. They were fighting for the future of their country, a future where they could live with dignity, not die in a futile, meaningless act of defiance. But the fanatics were relentless. They fought with a suicidal abandon, charging into machine gun fire, their bodies a testament to a blind and uncompromising faith. The casualties on both sides were mounting. It was a battle no one would win, only lose. Jack, seeing the futility of the assault, knew he had to do something. Something drastic, something that would end the bloodshed. He saw the Japanese colonel perched on a high ridge directing his men, his face a mask of fanatical zeal. Jack looked at Kenji, and in their eyes a silent understanding passed between them. They had to end this. They had to take out the head of the snake. They devised a plan, a reckless two-man assault on the colonel's position. It was a suicide mission, a final gamble. They would scale the treacherous ridge exposed to enemy fire and take out the colonel. As they began their ascent, a volley of rifle fire rained down on them. Kenji, in a moment of selfless courage, shielded Jack, taking a bullet in the shoulder. He cried out in pain, but he didn't stop. He pushed forward, his resolve unwavering. They reached the top, bleeding and battered, and came face to face with the colonel. The man, seeing his countrymen fighting alongside the Americans, screamed, "Traitors!" He raised his rifle not at them, but at Kenji, the one he saw as the ultimate symbol of his betrayal. But before he could fire, Jack, in a flash of motion, tackled him. They wrestled, a desperate, violent struggle on the edge of the cliff. The colonel, a man consumed by hatred, was strong, but Jack was fighting with a fury born of compassion. He fought not to kill, but to stop. He disarmed the colonel and held him, not with a weapon, but with his hands. "It's over!" he yelled, his voice ragged with exhaustion. "It's over! No more fighting!" The colonel, his face twisted with rage and despair, looked at him, then at Kenji, and at the bloody battlefield below. He saw his men, dying for a cause he now realized was a lie. He saw the American soldiers, not as an enemy, but as men who had fought with courage and honor. He saw a world where his rigid ideals had no place. And as he looked into Jack's eyes, he saw not a soldier, but a human being, a man who had shown kindness in the face of hatred. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound of profound and utter defeat. He lowered his head, a sign of surrender. The battle was over. But the long road to healing and reconciliation was just beginning. And for Jack and his men, the hardest part was not the war itself, but the challenge of returning to a world that could never understand what they had seen, what they had learned, what they had been through. They had to go home, but they knew, in their hearts, that they would forever be changed by the act of kindness that had transcended the brutal realities of war. They would have to live with the ghosts of the past, the memories of the men they had killed, and the quiet, haunting memory of the children they had saved. They would have to find a way to live in a world that had forgotten the lessons they had learned on a distant, blood-soaked island. They would have to live with the knowledge that the greatest victory of all was not won on the battlefield, but in the heart of a human being. The war was over, but the war within them was only just beginning. Tools.